Father, we just thank you and we praise you for this time to come together. Just pray that you would just bless this study, Father, bless the work that I put into it, and pray that you would just take it and use it, Father, for it is yours. And I'm just building on what you've given us. And just thank you and praise you again for everything. And say all this in the name of Yeshua. Amen.
Amen.
All right. All right. So it has been a few weeks, 4 to be precise. So last time we were in James, we covered a number of the challenges that James lays before his readers. The first was playing the idea of the first is last and last is first. I talked a bit about the modern translations and how we've twisted this concept just enough to miss the original meaning. How James is talking here about celebrating when the low and humble are raised and when the rich find humility, rather than it tends to be translated that the lowly should celebrate their own success and we should celebrate the downfall of the rich. James wanted the rich to recognize that their wealth is transient, that in the light of the Messiah, it just withers away to nothing. We talked about how James sees temptations and trials, how he believes that we cannot blame God for those trials and temptations we undergo, but that we should recognize that our temptations stem from our own desires. He expounds upon this when he declares that our desires conceive and give birth to sin. I also pointed out the fluid tense of the conclusion that sin brings forth death when it is complete. This implies that sin is a journey born out of our desires, and until the journey has been completed, we can still turn away from the endpoint. He goes on to argue that the reason that we cannot blame God for our trials and temptations is because all good and perfect gifts from on high, from the Father of light. Talked about how we can define the first fruits that James refers to as being the foundation of the church, where the Messiah was the cornerstone. Lastly, we talked about the definitions that James applies to patience, specifically what it means to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Where James makes it clear that our anger does not produce God's righteousness, which is where we had left off. Someone would like to read the verses 21 through 27 for us, please.
I'll make an attempt.
Okay.
Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourself. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstrained from the world. Wash your feet. I added that in, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's symbolic, certainly. So as we've discussed already, James builds layers in his writing, right? Verse 21 is no exception, as James' words assume that his reader has accepted the prior statements and is ready to build upon them. He opens with the word dio, which is often translated therefore, because, and he instructs us clearly apothemenoi, or maybe not so clearly. So Strong's points us to apothemi, which means to put away or stow away. However, I couldn't find that direct translation. The similar word that I found was apothemelio, and that actually means to destroy utterly, which I thought was an interesting take on it. And if we go to the root word apotheo, it means to run away. And I think, personally, I think both words are closer to James' choice here, conveys a much stronger, though similar meaning, right? Because it's a little bit stronger than just put away. This is, we want to destroy, to utterly, to run away from. And what are we running away from? It's specifically, he says that what we should be destroying here is the riparian kai parasian kakias. Riparian is translated as dirt or filth. It's a metaphorical sordidness. What's that?
Dirty feet.
Yes. It's another way of saying something that lacks value or merit. So we're talking in truth about uncleanness, right? A concept that Hebrew people understood it intimately, is the devout live their lives seeking to avoid being unclean. So I think we can safely, knowing James' audience, translate riparian as uncleanness. So he's saying that we are destroying all uncleanness. And he adds to this with paraseion, and that translates as surplus, abundance, or advantage, and kakias, referring to badness, cowardice, vice, moral badness, or philosophically evil. So can you understand now why I believe that it's not just setting something aside that James is speaking about? He wants us to utterly destroy, or at the very least, run away from uncleanness and abundant evil. This contextually ties back to what James was saying about how our anger does not produce God's righteousness in the way he words it. Thus, we can draw a dotted line from our anger to uncleanness and abundant evil. You guys agree?
Agreed.
Now, excuse me, James seems to switch gears with his next line, but I want you to think back to me with what we discussed last time in the concepts of humility and acceptance and patience and perseverance. He tells us in protiti or proeotes, which translates as mildness or meekness, dexaste. And the closest word I keep getting pointed to seems to be dekomai, which is generally translated as accept. So, but then when we dig a little deeper, we find dexis, which translates to reception or a part of the liver. It's a little bit strange, but then I started to think more about it. And how do the Greeks philosophically tend to see the liver as the center of the soul and the source of emotion? So the Hebrew people, similarly, when I dug deeper, saw the liver as the seat of life. In the Talmud, the rabbis over time came to the conclusion that since the meat of an animal can't be eaten once the liver has been removed, that a man cannot live without his liver. Therefore, that liver must be incredibly important. The Bible has many references to liver, both indirect and direct, and we have several stories of men dying when their liver is pierced by an arrow. Additionally, the Talmud references that the liver causes anger. So we get from this two meanings, the first being the straightforward and mild reception or humble reception. Secondly, we can see a more metaphorical meaning with put mildness or gentleness to your anger or emotions. So both translations, I think, are valid, and that we know that in order to be receptive, we must be able to put aside our pride, as James wants us to emphaiton, and the word. So emphaiton translates directly as inborn, natural. It can also refer to something planted or implanted. In other words, James wants the word to be naturally in us. And we can't do that if we don't first destroy the uncleanness and abundant evil and humble ourselves. James makes it clear to us that it is the word which is capable and strong enough to make safe our lives. Though many translations translate this as souls, the truth of the matter is that James is referencing the Greek psyche, which is life, but also the immaterial, that which makes us, us.
Now, can I share something? Medically speaking, the liver, to start with, filters the poisons from the blood.
Yeah.
It's one of the most venous types. If your liver stops working, you quickly get jaundice and you quickly begin to die. Your liver is so vital to the body, and that you just have to have it. And the liver is also a source, if you were to eat it, of vitamin iron.
Iron, yes.
Of iron. It's a source of life. Without iron, we can't live either.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other vitamins that are found in the liver. I don't remember all of them, but it's very, very healthy organ. I know Megan, whenever we talk about liver, always goes.
No, I said A is one of them.
A, yes.
A, yes, A is one of them. The liver is a key component, in your body. Now, we always reference the heart as the key component. It's a pump, but did you realize you have two hearts?
Right, the lymphatic heart and then the regular heart.
And if the lymphatic heart stops, you stop too. Because the lymphatic heart is one that pumps the lymphatic fluid through the system, which helps to fight disease.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the liver is the purifying organ in our body.
That's right. The
So
liver.
if the liver purifies everything, that whole picture that's being painted is really, really neat. I've never heard that with liver being part of that. But yeah, the whole thing that he's saying is to put away all the junk
Yeah.
and have planted into your heart through the word of God, everything that purifies.
Yeah.
That's right. And the liver purifies.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was an interesting thing. But then I'm using a lot of extra biblical translation resources now. And that's why I'm starting to find these unusual elements of the words, because the translations are not colored by religious text, which a lot of the resources that I think most biblical scholars use are colored these days by the biblical stuff. So you have translation being manipulated by context, which is not a bad thing. But what ends up happening is we can miss things like, for example, that dexasty, being referencing to a part of the liver. That's not something that was in any resource except for the non-biblical translation information.
Interesting.
If you saw my Greek lexicon here, you'd find it.
Yeah.
I've been there before. So
Yeah,
anyway, go
it's
on.
fun, right? It's been fun. So moving on. So James, he goes on to give us a taste of the idea of physically acting upon the commands of the word, right? So this is a natural extension of where he's been going. He uses the word hoitai, and that translates as made, invented, maker, composer, workman, etc. He wants us to be makers of the word, not hearers only, right? So we typically read that as doers, but it's a lot bigger than just doing. It's all encompassing of that creation sense. And then he suggests that those who listen only paralogizomenoi themselves. And that translates as cheat, defraud, mislead by fallacious reason, right? So it's a little bit worse than just deceiving, right? It's this idea of misleading yourself, taking this sense here, right? You can follow with me where he's going. By listening without action, there is this idea that we are cheating ourselves out of, or potentially maybe even directly attacking a practice that suggests all you need to do is listen to the word, and that's enough.
No, and you get an idea at the very beginning of the book that God gave us in Bereshit, in Genesis. The servant doesn't really lie, but has God said. He takes the word and gently changes it. And that's the problem, is when we do the reasoning like that without looking at the meaning of it, we're getting nowhere. We're twisting the word. We're changing the word. We're making it so that we say we don't have to do anything at all. It's all been done for us. No, we are here as God's soldiers. We are here as God's people. We are to be doers of the word, to create an environment that people will want to know him, that people will come and feel at home and loved. Sorry, I preached a sermon.
Oh, all right. It's all right. So James gives us this interesting viewpoint on how he thinks of those he refers to as hearers and not doers. He describes them as a man katanu unti, and that translates as observe well, understand, apprehend, perceive, considered, look at, view, to be in one's right mind. This observation understanding is directed at the prosopon, which can mean face or countenance, but it can also refer to a facade, such as in the way that one puts on a face for the world to see, even if it's not really who they are. The observed countenance is described as a genosis, which is the origin, source, potentially beginning. You'll notice similarity to the word Genesis, which, as you can see, is a Greek word, right? So that's where we get the word Genesis from. We have an observed or understood countenance or facade, the beginning or origin, and it's all found in the esoptro, or the looking glass. And I brought in a picture here. This is a relic found, a Roman looking glass. It was brass. It would have been polished until it was shiny enough to be reflective. Obviously, they haven't restored it. The material is very corroded. But if you think about what is the reflection you get from a metal surface, even when it's flat,
it's still going to be somewhat distorted, right?
Exactly. And so I think that that's something we need to consider here in when we're thinking about what is James getting at here when he talks about observing your face, because it's not really who you are per se, right? Because he talks about the hearer, then eutheos palatheto, and that essentially means they directly, immediately, straight away lapse into forgetfulness or cause to forget the hopoios, which is a sort of quality of something, in this case, the individual.
Do you need to change the slide?
Yeah, that's in verse 20.
Thank you.
That's fine. I forgot that I had blended the two together here. There are two things that stand out to me when I read this. First is that in the Greek world, that reflection was thought to reveal one's soul. So the fact that James is referring to the reflection in this case as a facade, it's compelling in itself. Did he believe that the reflection was false or not the real person? However, the focus on the origin in relationship to the reflection brings us back to the idea that when you hear the word but don't act on it, you're getting a glimpse into your soul and then walking away to promptly forget, right? You no longer remember who you truly are. The second bit that stands out to me is this idea of forgetting something so ingrained, so a part of yourself. We learn who we are from a young age, and the idea of forgetting yourself the instant you walk away is disheartening. Yet I can tell you this, even when I sit and write notes, 9 times out of 10, I can't tell you what a sermon is about days later. I'm sure that's something you guys can relate to. I've been trying more and more to keep in mind this concept that we need to act upon what we learn from God's word, because if we don't, the adversary will steal it away from our hearts, which of course leads us right to Yeshua and the parable of the man who sows the seeds. So this is certainly, James really challenges us in that regard. James has already suggested that the doer does not forget the way, the one who only hears the word. However, he takes us a little deeper into what makes the doer different. The doer is described as being parakipsis, eis nomon teleon. Parakipsis is an interesting word for us to explore here. The word is used to refer to frivolous actions in the act of stooping to one side or peeping in. The root word is parakipto, which additionally refers to the act of stooping for the purpose of looking, casting a careless glance. It was often used to refer to someone peeping after a lover. And that little part I kind of latched onto there. So you can understand why Thayer maybe dodged the oddness of the word and takes it as to look at with head bowed forward. But focusing on the idea of an intense stare, which would certainly fit with the seriousness of the words that James has been using. However, I strongly believe that James uses the word he intends to use with full intended meaning, even if it's meant as a metaphor. So let's look a little more closely, unintended, as we can think about this word. When we think of peeping after a lover, casting a sideways glance, etc., what does that make you think about?
It's a feeling of emotion of the heart, of the whole being, the longing to be with that person. And so you're peeping into the perfect law. The whole being is in love and alive with that person, that concept. You want to be a doer of God's, or a maker of God's word.
I love it. I love it. In context, it may seem in contrast, but it implies intense study and observation, and that furtive glance, and for the one who takes actions, it's like a hyperbole of the situation. The absurdity, the idea that a stolen glance lasts longer than a focused stare, right? And you think back to your youth when you first met that person that you come to marry now, and those stolen glances and how they just linger with you. Those are the things you remember later. Sometimes not even just the intense moments. It's the
I remember staring at the back of your head. Going, wow.
To build upon what my dad was saying too, is that whole fact that it's the something we greatly desire too, right? We lean over, right? We're peeping in something that might seem forbidden, trying to desperately get a glimpse of what we want to see. whatever is seen, it won't be forgotten. Like that whole thing of as a child, you sneaking to peep on something that's forbidden, right? Those memories stick with you. Those things, you don't forget them. It's a stupid song, but I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, for some stupid reason, it has stuck with my head, but it's that same sort of concept, right? The kid remembers this moment because he's not supposed to be awake. He's sneaking down. He sees this event happening, right? But it's the same sort of sense that I think that James is getting at here with, it's not just, oh, I'm staring intently at it. No, I'm looking at it with that longing, that desire, that sense of that lasts and sticks with you. And what are we peeping into, right? He Very already mentioned it, but it's the nomon teleon. Teleon being, that adverb we talked about before, perfection, accomplishment, completeness. And nomon, we've also talked about in great detail, but while translated law, it means practice, custom. It's used by the Septuagint to refer to the law of God. So it's the perfect law of God. We have this contrasting example, the one who makes fervent glances at the perfect law of God versus the one who stares long and hard at his own image and then promptly forgets. And if we think about looking deep into the soul and then forgetting, can also be connected through that dotted line sense back to the word. It's the listener is someone who looks into the word and then forgets, where the doer is glancing furtively. And
Dancing in love with their master into the law, wanting to do whatever pleases God, be pleasing to God and useful to God, where the other person looks at their image and then forgets that their image is not something that's not so good. It's not so good. And they forget it when they walk away from it.
Yeah.
I see that almost every day these days. So anyway.
Yeah, no, James makes it clear that this law is eleutherius, and that means freedom and liberty. And that's not something we always connect with law, especially with the law of God from the Old Testament. But that's how he describes it. And he says the doer paramenes, and that means to stand one's ground, right? So we have it translated here as perseveres, but it means to stand one's ground, to stay beside, to endure. And then he clarifies it further when he says that person, this contrasting person, is not forgetful, but poietes. And that's the maker, the workman, the composer, etc. He explains that the workman will go on to be blessed, happy in the act of being that workman, the maker, the author, etc. Then he takes this, I think, a logical step, and he goes on and he's condemning hypocrisy here in verse 26. He's focused on the specific type, one that will seem familiar to all of us. He refers to anyone who dokai thriskos. Dokai is typically translated as seems good or determined. Focus here on the appearance or opinion of one. Our translation uses thinks, but it's a broader sense. And I look at it more as a determined attempt to appear a certain way. When we say that someone seems a particular way, we're saying that outwardly they come across as a specific type of person. And thriskos, simply religious, superstitious. So we're talking here about those who put on airs of religiosity.
Like piety, showing or putting on that pious attitude.
Hey, look at me, I'm fasting every day. I am fasting, folks.
It's interesting, pious has this, pious has this definition, of being pure and following the law and everything. But I've always, because of the way the Bible uses it, I've always had a negative connotation with that word, because pious people are the ones that are putting on the show, that are doing the act. Like when Yeshua talks to the people about the widow who gives what little she has, and the people who pray quietly versus the Pharisees who donate a ton of money and shout their prayers as they stand gloriously, grandstanding. Those are the people that I see as pious, as the people who are faking it. Sorry.
And then you have the quiet people that actually carry the weight and the burden of the job, the soldiers of God that sit there when they're being humiliated and say, Lord, you are able to handle it. I can't. Help me. And they go forward. It's a big different story, and it's a peeling away. And I think in this age we're living in right now, since 2 Chronicles 7:13, and you should all go back and review it. The judgment was on God's people. The judgment is still here. And we're having a peeling away of the pious, the religious, down to those that'll shine like brighter than the stars in the sky, because the light of God will shine through them. And those are the people that are not standing up, yelling and screaming, look at me.
So
Yeah, and and that fits obviously with what we're talking about here, because James says, he's not denying the possibility they are what they are, but he says, are they chalinogogon closon? And chalinogogon refers to the one who guides with bit and bridle. So the bridling, and what's being bridled, the gloson or the tongue, specifically as an organ of speech. So James tells us that the one who seems religious but fails to bridle the tongue is deceiving their own heart or purpose, and thus their religion is mateos, or vain, empty, idle. Even in some uses can be found offensive, foolish, or even irreverent. And it's really kind of funny because I know a guy named Mateos. But when you think about it, this is a particularly harsh condemnation of those who put on airs of religiousness. Certainly.
Yes.
This is not Greek.
True enough. So likely in an attempt to forestall the questions that James knew his challenge would generate, he added what he considered to be the definition of religion, that is kathara kai amiantos. Kathara specifically means something physically clean, spotless, pure, such as winnowed grain. Amiantos is undefiled, pure, free from stain. Two similar words, but we can perhaps put them together to mean spotless and pure, or sifted and undefiled. Either way we look at it, you get the impression he's referring to something that has not been touched by evil or sin. Religion that has not been corrupted might be the simplest way to look at it. Specifically, he refers to it as the uncorrupted religion before God and Father. This he defines as episkeptesthai, which interestingly enough means to examine or consider, which is a bit different from visiting, as most translations lean on. However, this is a stretch on the word episkotomai rather than the word I felt was closer, which is episkoptios. We can in context see the full word in use is found contextually in situations where the root word refers to making rounds and visitation. Meanings are close enough for us to move on and consider the who being specifically the orphans and widows, right? No confusion here. He wants us to do so in their flip side, and that's pressure, oppression, or affliction. He also adds to that the expectation of aspelon, which is referring to keeping oneself faultless and without blemish from the cosmo. Cosmo being an interesting word with multiple translations. The first being order or good order. It's often used in relation to honor, but in context, why would we keep ourselves unblemished from good order? It also is used to refer to the world order, the universe, or even the known and inhabited world. And in many religious writings, it's used to refer to the kingdom of evil. And is likely used subsequently in other Jewish writings. So keeping both context and audience in mind, we can likely assume that what James is striving to achieve is to associate pure religion with keeping oneself faultless in relation to the kingdom of evil.
Which the kingdom of evil is, the king is the one, the evil king, Satan as we know him, is the one that rules over mankind.
James?
And Yeshua said that, call him the God of this world, because that's the one who people worship. When they think they're worshiping self or something else, they're worshiping the evil one if they're not worshiping God.
I think too, Daniel, that all of this, the whole thing of being undefiled before God and then going into the visit orphans and widows and their affliction and stuff, it's all a picture of being unself-absorbed. It's all a picture of love, where I'm not trying to, and the same thing with the keep oneself unstained from the world. It's the world honors the guy who's the big shot, and the Lord is just saying, or James is saying here, if you really get it, if you're really doing what the Lord has called you to do, visiting orphans and widows. What are orphans and widows? They're people, they have nothing that they can give back to you. You're not going to get anything in return. It's a sheer love. It's not a self-aggrandizement. It's not I'm going to get something back. I'm impressing somebody that's going to, give me something or raise my status or whatever. And just a sensitivity to other people and to keep oneself unstained from the world. It's total opposition to the way that the world deals with things.
Yeah.
It's an antithesis of worldly success,
Yeah,
so to speak. Yeah.
absolutely.
Well said.
So just a really quick recap of the section before we go on to chapter 2. So what has he said to us about religion? He's told us that the one who seems religious but has an unbridled tongue is one who deceives his own heart, and his religion is empty and vain. But the one whose religion is pure considers the orphans and widows and keeps themselves untouched by the kingdom of evil. So just, I sometimes I find it good to go back and think for a moment, what is it that we've just read?
Mhm.
Jan, would you like to read
Sure.
the 7 verses of 2 for us?
Okay. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in the good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down here at my feet. Have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers. Has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in the faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called?
So as we move at long last into chapter 2, we're shifting gears slightly. James expounds upon his expectations of those who claim the name of Yeshua, call themselves his brothers specifically, right? So that's, he's opening with brothers, beloved brothers. And he calls on the brothers to act without prosopolisias, and that translates to partiality or prejudice, when referring to holding the faith of the Lord Jesus Christ. And interestingly enough, specifically of glory. Furthermore, when we say holding, we're talking about exete, and that refers to possession. So we're talking, and it's most commonly used to refer to property. We're talking about personal faith that we can be considered uniquely yours. And the glory of which James speaks of is the doxis. That's an expectation without surprise, often referencing good reputation and often used when speaking of someone who is of higher rank or position. So we have this sense of, he wants them to step into this situation here without any prejudice when regards to their personal faith. And his intent is explained here in this situational example, a hypothetical, if you will. He begins the scenario with the entrance of a man with a gold ring and clothing that is lampra, or bright, radiant like the sun. In other words, clean without dirt, something that pretty much only the wealthy can accomplish in the Roman world. In contrast, he suggests at the same time in walks a patokos, and it's translated here in our English as a poor man, but the word really literally means beggar. So, and he's wearing something that is repara, filthy, dirty, or even uncultured, made of lesser materials. You have this big contrast And I found it very interesting, the specific reference here, though, to not just clean clothing, but the gold ring of wealth. As he goes on with his scenario, James is pointing to how we tend to pay attention to those signs of wealth. He points to how we treat the wealthy when we say kathu hode kalos, kathu meaning a seat, but can often be used specifically with regards to courts, councils, assemblies, a seat within a court, right? So, and kalos translating is beautiful, good, fine, quality, auspicious. In other words, offering him the best seat in the room. Some might translate this as the seat of honor. Right? In contrast, we see that the beggar is not even offered a seat, but made to stand, or worse yet, to sit on the floor under the footstool. In other words, the least important position in the house to be at someone's feet, much like a dog. We can take that analogy for a moment and think about the fact that while the Hebrew people have dogs, the dog is considered to be an unclean animal because of, you know, the fact that it will return to its own vomit, eat its own poop.
Yeah. Roll in it too, you know.
Tell me about it.
I'm the one that bathes her when she does that.
Well, she is supposed to be your dog. Sorry, did you have something, Jan, you wanted to add?
No.
All right. James condemns this example, right? He's implying that this is exactly what they're doing, and he accuses them of diakrithete. And that may be a familiar word to you, as we've touched upon it in the past. It means to separate one from another or to be divorced. So it can also be used in the fashion of distinguishing or making a distinction. So it's my personal opinion that what he's saying is that they've not separated themselves from this worldly idea. And I believe is held up in the context where he goes on to accuse them of being kritai dialogismon poniron. And kritai is a judge, a dialogismon being the act of balancing accounts, consideration, discussion, and lastly, poniron being worthless, base, cowardly, even malicious. In other words, a judge who balances worthless accounts. So harsh words, as it implies the mere act of judging others by their appearance, is a worthless act. Agree with it. So.
I wanted to say something. It was like, sometimes people, I see this, they're so afraid of giving partiality to the rich that they go wholly in the other direction. And I feel that is wrong as well. We should not punish or get to the point where we are in contempt for them. I feel like we should give them pity and try to help them see the truth of what their money is, but we shouldn't go so far into helping the poor that we hold the rich in contempt. We just need to hold them accountable for their actions and for who they are, and take each individual for who they are.
I think that ties back into what we discussed last time, with where James is talking about the celebrating what appears to be, at surface level, celebrating the downfall of the rich. But really I feel he was getting at is this idea that we should be celebrating when the rich recognize the transience of their wealth and can become humble enough to acknowledge the Father. I don't think there's ever anything saying in the scriptures that the rich need to be poor, right?
Well, no. Think of Abraham.
Right.
Abraham was considered one of the most wealthy and richest men of his time. And yet he was called the friend of God because his heart was totally in love. He was totally in love with God, and he did and followed. And God loved the fact that he gave hospitality. God loved the fact that he wanted God more than anything else.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's the arrogance of the rich that is sometimes repugnant thing or the thing that
Right.
isn't good. It's not being rich. It's the arrogance, and it's all about me.
Right.
All about the attitude of the heart.
Yes,
That's right.
attitude of the
The
heart.
attitude of the
Exactly.
heart, the attitude of the liver.
Yeah.
I mean,
the-
I have met plenty of people in both situations who are extremely arrogant.
Sure.
But then I've also met people who are very well off, who are very kind and considerate and humble.
That's
And
right.
So, we can't just say, oh, because this person's rich, they're going to be arrogant. I've met some really
No, absolutely. Yeah.
arrogant, poor people.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
But-
arrogance can kind of swing anyway, but
Yeah.
but it's a temptation sometimes of the rich to be arrogant, and I think that's the part that the Lord comes down on. It's not the wealth; it's the
Yes.
Right.
it's all about me attitude. The it's all about me attitude. Yeah, that goes through the whole ranks of rich, poor, in between.
Amen.
Yeah, and it's a very rampant thing in today's world of it's all about me.
Yeah.
Thing. I get so frustrated with the advertisements. You hear so many advertisements. Do this because you deserve it. How do they know what I deserve? I may be a real schmuck. You
Yeah.
know?
True enough.
And it's but they use that all the time. Oh, you deserve this and you deserve that. It's just go get over yourself. Anyway, I digress. Go
But
ahead.
it sells, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
Because that's the world we live in. And
Well,
I
yeah,
think-
it has brainwashed a lot of people. A lot of people, we have the entitlement generation, and it gets, it continues to be perpetrated, and people kind of lap that up. It makes them, I guess it makes them feel good about themselves to feel like, yeah, I do deserve that. I'm kidding.
Well, it's sadly to say, you can see it too. And if you go back just a little ways to the whole, the customer is always right attitude. I can't, dealing with what I deal with, I get all the time those people that, well, I'm right, so therefore you should be doing something for me. And I'm looking at the situation, for example, you get someone that's got a 5-year-old microwave that's rusty. And, it's a situation where I'm telling them, I'm sorry, we're not going to do anything for you. It has a 1-year warranty. I don't know what you did to it in the last 4 years.
Make it rust.
Exactly.
Can I add another light to this, please?
Yeah, go for it.
When we were a missionary in one of our missionary trips, okay, we went to Mexico, and one of the people told us something. They said, these people in this village, they're so poor and so downtrodden that you will be amazed at the faith they have. When they came to the service and this old man was asked to preach, he hadn't been prepared. And I prayed for this one girl. Now, this was not my doing because I didn't even know something had happened. I prayed for her. Whatever she needs, Lord, do it for her. That woman believed so much that God would deal with her. She had such great faith that she was totally healed, and turned out she had a big
Abscess in her tooth.
They said the bone down to the jaw, and they couldn't afford to do anything. That the woman was hurting majorly. And they called it a great miracle. God did that. But because you see, the poor in the world, those that don't sit back and say, hey, look at what I got. I got a house full of items. I really don't need you, Lord. They sit back and say, I got nothing.
Yeah.
Lord, it's up to you.
That is the one thing that comes with poverty, is the ability to many times to lean on God. But at the same time, there's plenty of people in extreme poverty that refuse to continue in their pride, not to lean on him.
That's right. That's right. It works all the way around. But it was wonderful to see that stuff. There were many other miracles in that land when we were there in the back areas. So anyway.
So James asks his readers this rhetorical question, and he knows that we will know the answer to it. And I assume that he assumed they would too. In fact, he suspects, I suspect he expects them to feel instantly ashamed of their behavior when he presents this question. He asks his beloved brothers, has God not exaltato, and then the poor or beggar to be rich or wealthy in faith. Exolato being the to pick or single out, to choose for oneself. James adds also that the poor have been chosen to be heirs of the kingdom, tying back to his earlier statement about the promises of those who love him. This ties us to the Beatitudes, right? When Yeshua said in Matthew 5:3 and 5, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Does this reference to inheritance remind you of any other scriptures? You nodding. I wasn't sure if anyone had anything pop to their surface of their mind. James, he doesn't just stop with a rhetorical reminder, though. He wants to make sure his audience really sees what they've been doing is wrong. Sometimes, and I think we can all be guilty of this, we hear something important, something we know is a rebuke, but we think to ourselves, that's not me, or I know that, but what is the truth? Many times we're just as guilty as the next. And when you stop at verse 5, you're letting the guilty off easily. They can walk away and say to themselves, yes, the poor inherit the kingdom. Good stuff. I've been in churches like that. They list off these grand ideas, but then they forget the meat. So what is the meat? He says to them, you itamasate, the poor, being the accusative form of atamazo, which means you hold in no honor, esteem lightly, treat as unworthy, put to shame, etc. So this is what James is accusing them of. Meanwhile, James points out the very rich man they hold in such high esteem is katadenastios, and the implication here of being an active, regular event, and translates as oppressing, so ongoing oppression. And the form of oppression that James cites here seems to be examples of things he's heard are happening to his audience, and that they are helkus and the brothers, which generally translates to dragging, drawing, pulling, or towing, and all this to a criteria, which translates most simply to court. It is also used to refer to a tribunal or means of judgment. As such, this would refer to the Roman courts, the local Sanhedrin, or other religious courts. James is leaning heavily into the irony that they would treat the poorest people poorly, meanwhile giving deference and honor to those who are dragging them before magistrates and judges. Though, I mean, he doesn't point out exactly what they're being taken to court for. But he makes it clear that their actions are acting blasphemusin, which refers to speaking profanely, sacred things, offering rash prayers, speaking ill, speaking impiously of God or irreverently of him. James declares that the speaking ill is against the kalon onoma. And kalon, we touched upon earlier, is beautiful, beauteous, or good, and onoma, simply name. I think we can assume here that James is referring to the name of Yeshua as being the target of the rich man. It becomes clear that from his perspective, those people are seeking to bring a negative light on those who follow Yeshua.
Does that sound familiar for today? Is that not happening in Canada, United States, even in Mexico right now? This is what seems to be, if a church meets, they're condemned. If people meet in a group to worship God, they're condemned. We have reached a stage in our society where this condemnation from those in power has become extreme. Pastors are dragged out of their churches and hauled before the magistrates, the very people they honored before. Yeah. It is happening in our very society in a parallel. To me, the poor in spirit are also those that recognize their state. They've looked into that perfect law of liberty and realized without God, they're nothing. They're worthless.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up here. James will continue to drive home his feelings about the treatment of others in relation to ourselves, but we set the foundation for next time. Just briefly recapping, as we move through several concepts. We began with James speaking to us about the importance of destroying the evil in our lives, embracing the word in humbleness. We went through James' most famous line about being a doer rather than a listener, and we talked about what that means in terms of analogy and metaphor. He seeks to present equivalencies that we hope will make sense to his readers. James went on to condemn the hypocrisy of those whose religion, as he puts it, is worthless because it is all words without action. He defines the basic tenets of pure and undefiled religion as being the acts of considering the orphans and widows. As we shifted into chapter 2, we saw that James is continuing to strike at hypocrisy in the form of partiality. He wants his readers to see what they have become when they treat people differently because of the clothing they wear and how foolish it is. And next time we'll dig deeper along with James into how he perceives the act of partiality in relation to God's law. Because as we progress into chapter 2, he's going to tie partiality specifically to sin. And that's where we're going to be going next. Any other thoughts or comments?
Other than to say, well said, well shared.
Thank you. You appreciate it. That's God's doing. I have been very scattered in the last few weeks because of all the stresses going on, which I'll talk about more when we get to prayer requests. So the fact that it came out coherent at all is the Father's doing, not mine. I was feeling completely all over the place in trying to find the focus to be able to work on this. But Dad, would you mind closing us in prayer if you're up to it?
Father, you know our hearts and our minds. Help us to kindle in us a spirit and desire to please you above all things. A love for what you've told us. For your word is our life, a lamp unto our feet. Your word is the perfect law, our liberty. Help us to be makers, doers, workers, so that others can see you and the light will so shine. Thank you for this that Daniel shared, because it awakens in us, because it's relevant for what seems to be going on right now in our daily society and the articles I read constantly. We praise you and bless you. And thank you again that we can get together as family and friends to share your word. In the name of Adonai Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen.
Amen.